Welcome to Gaylord College at the University of Oklahoma and the continuing series of this Presidential Dream Course, Journalism Under Siege. Tonight, we're going to be talking about journalists dying to cover the news, hashtag real news. And in my 3 decades working for networks overseas in conflict zones, I didn't realize how blessed I was all that time, because anywhere we would go, we had cars, drivers, security details, especially in the last 20 to 15 years. We had insurance, we had an infrastructure behind us, and sometimes we had people cooking our meals. And then in 29, I left NBC News to work as a freelancer in Iraq and Afghanistan and working on my film. And suddenly I realized how exposed I was and how exposed these freelancers were around the globe that I had worked around all those years. I really didn't get it. Freelancers are the most vulnerable who are out there and the most brave, because they have themselves and sometimes their friends. And we have 2 people with us tonight we are so honored to have on this campus. First, I want to introduce Michael Scott Moore, who came in from Los Angeles. Michael Scott Moore has written for the New Republic, the Atlantic, and the LA Times. And in 2010, he authored a book about surfing that was named one of the top 10 books that year by The Economist, which we were just talking about is a better list to be on than the New York Times bestseller list.
I think it's the top 50. But
top, okay. Well, I'm going to say top 10.
Okay.
Sweetness and Blood, and it was the history of surfing. But this is not a guy who just covers surfing. He was a theater critic for San Francisco Weekly at one point. But I want to get into this with him. At some point, he became interested in conflict reporting, and I assume it might have been when he was working in Germany. He holds German and U.S. citizenship. He covered the trial of Somali pirates in Germany who had been captured outside of Somalia in international waters. That trial was held in Hamburg, and you covered that trial. And in 2012, January of 2012, he ended up in Somalia to work on a book that was funded by the Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting about the Somali pirates.
We're going articles towards the book, yeah.
And we're going to get into your story in a little bit. But next, I want to introduce Diane Foley. Diane, welcome.
Thank you.
Diane came here today from New Hampshire. Diane is the mother of James Foley, a well-known freelance journalist who was murdered by ISIS in 2012. Proof of his death came in a video that ISIS released on the internet. He was abducted in November of 2012, a month after he had come home for his birthday and flown back to Syria. James had experience with conflict reporting. It became his passion. In 2011, he was abducted in Libya by pro-Gaddafi forces, we assume, and released after how many days, Diane?
44 days.
44 days. But that didn't deter him from moving to other critical stories that needed to be told in that era. James is a man that I met in Afghanistan, and I believe it was in Helmand Province when we were covering U.S. Marine operations there in the South in 2010 and 2011. And I believe it was in 2011 when my son Carlos and I met him in Afghanistan. And he was a great young man. Me, I'm old, but he was already by that time a very experienced journalist and very well known, and people said, hey, James Foley's coming to to this base, and thank you for being here.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
I have to ask you, Diane, why did he go back to Syria? Why did he go to Syria after being abducted in Libya? Why did he want to be a conflict journalist and continue on with it when he had been abducted and almost lost his life the first time?
Well, Jim became very passionate about what the people in the Middle East were yearning for, really. He became, I think, in many ways, I think when you are an independent journalist, you live among the people. So it's somewhat different than, he became very close friends with a lot of the people that in the country and could feel their yearning for freedom, and realized they were willing to risk their very lives to, you know, obtain freedom. I think he was very interested in what was happening. It was like history unfolding. And he also felt that because of the danger in the area, fewer and fewer staff reporters were being sent there. And he felt it was important news for the Western world, if you will, that we needed to know how much they yearned for freedom. And he became very passionate about those stories.
Did you as a mother try to talk him out of it?
Absolutely. Oh, yes. But he told me he'd found his passion. He really, Jim had always been the kind of person that really wanted to champion the underdog. He was always, and he was a great listener, and he was very interested in people's stories. And I think the more he heard and the more he saw their suffering and their willingness to sacrifice to obtain some freedom, the more he felt it was important to share. And he felt he needed to do this work.
Well, you know, a lot of students in this room are thinking about being a reporter covering foreign news, and I hope that they are, because we need more of them. And you talked about the underdog, and Jim really championed the underdog even before he became a journalist. He was teaching in prisons, underprivileged children, correct?
Yeah, he was. I think once Jim started realizing the other side of life in our United States, some of the poverty, he taught in the inner cities of Phoenix and Chicago with Teach for America, and then at the Cook County Jail boot camp while he was going to college, while he was going to graduate school actually at Medill. He became, you know, really passionate about the need for these voices to be heard too, if you will. That he really felt they were important stories, important issues for him to champion, if you will.
Can you go back, and I know it's difficult, but can you go back and tell us about that day that he disappeared in November of 2012?
Sure. It was Thanksgiving. It was the morning after. It was Thanksgiving Day, and very odd that we had not heard from Jim. Very odd, because he was very good about calling, always on the holidays, no matter where he was in the world. And we hadn't heard from him. And it was the morning after, and we received a call from a colleague. And, you know, we just couldn't believe that he'd been kidnapped again. But at that point, that's exactly what the jihadists were doing in that part of the world. They were targeting journalists. They didn't want them to report what was going on. They didn't want the Western world to know what was going on at all.
And at that time, he was working for Global Post?
Yes, and Agence France Presse, AFP. He was a freelancer. So he sold his work to whomever, you know, would take it, if you will. So he was on his own, without security backing and without insurance, without, like most freelancers, like yourself, yeah. Michael, you know, that is a very common experience for independent journalists today.
And in the subsequent 2 years, another journalist had been kidnapped, but this time in Somalia, and it was you, Michael.
Mm-hmm. I was kidnapped before Jim, matter of fact.
Yes, you were.
And Diane, you had been in touch with his family, is that correct?
probably after you'd been in captivity 18 months or so, yeah. Yes, I forget how that happened, but after a year with no word from Jim, I was eager to reach out to any families who are in our situation, and that's how I contacted Michael's mother.
Yeah.
Because it's kind of a quiet, kind of a silent crisis, and a lot of people don't want to know or don't dare share that someone they love has been kidnapped. So.
And in my case, my mom and the organizations I was working for were deliberately keeping it quiet. So after a flurry of news reports after I got kidnapped, there was nothing, and that was on purpose. I had been working for Spiegel in Berlin, and they sort of led the way. Spiegel told the New York Times and the papers in London and that kind of thing to just sort of keep it quiet and don't keep reporting updates, because it was the family's wish, and it was always my mother's decision to keep it out of the news.
Well, tell me, I mean, I've covered a lot of places in Africa and the Middle East, and I've always said one country for me that's a no-go place is Somalia. So how did you end up from doing a book on surfing to ending up in Somalia? What were you doing there?
Well, I was working the whole time for Spiegel Online, and when 10 pirates came to Hamburg, I was extremely interested in that. So, in fact, I'd already done a little bit of research about Somali pirates anyway, because I'd been reporting the news about them from the desk, you know. And once the trial started, I started to get contacts among the Somali community within Germany that suggested we could, one other journalist and I could find a safe way to go to central Somalia. And there was one elder in Germany who had taken a German journalist through the same region just a few months before. And I knew of some New York Times journalists and some others who had done a similar trip to what we were planning. So we went there, we planned the trip with this particular elder to go to this town, which was a town where most of the men in the courtroom came from, and then to go out to Hobyo, which was exactly the route that other journalists had taken. I'd noticed that it was something that journalists did. It was something you could do in Somalia without getting kidnapped. And since this elder had a track record, we decided, you know, to go with him. My partner was Ashwin Rahman, who's been to Afghanistan about 20 times. I met him in Djibouti in about 2009, and we thought, yeah, well, we both have projects we're interested in Somalia, and we could probably do it. We could probably make it work. So I found a grant from the Pulitzer Center and some support from some magazines, including The Atlantic, and so we went in 2012. And we spent about 10 days going from Galkayo, which is a city in the middle of Somalia, out to the coast, Hobyo. We actually did interview a pirate boss out there, and we came back, and all that went fine. But then Ashwin decided to fly to Mogadishu, which was a change in plan. We were planning to fly in and out from Kenya together, in and out of Somalia, which meant we had to go to the airport. Our flights back, my flight back to Kenya, his flight to Mogadishu would have been on separate days. So first we went to say goodbye to Ashwin, let him get on the plane, and coming back from the airport on the way back to the hotel is when a truck, it was actually a technical with a cannon in the back, was waiting for our car, and about 12 guys with guns came flowing off the bed of this truck, and they knew exactly where to find me. They saw me in the car, they opened the door, they pulled me out, they beat me on the head, they broke my wrist, and they bundled me into another car and drove me off. So I was held for about for 2 years and 8 months. And of course, it was a nightmare for my family. It was a nightmare for my mother, but she had relatively good support from the FBI.
You know, and we'll get into the differences between your particular abduction and James's abduction and murder. But, you know, one of the things as a journalist, you go into a zone that everyone says is horrific and it's bad, and you get there and it has a different feel when you hit. Mm-hmm. You say to yourself, well, it's not that bad. Mm-hmm. And then something happens out of the blue you don't even expect. Is that kind of what happened to you?
That's exactly what happened, yeah. Especially after we made the trip out to Hobyo. I felt good, you know. That was the dangerous part of the trip. And once we were back in Galkayo, in this town, everything felt familiar. We'd spent a few days there, and then we did this dangerous thing, and we came back. Well, we both felt pretty good. But it was the airport road that turned out to be dangerous. And also doubling back. You know, the one bush pilot who I met later told me that when he goes to Somalia, he tries never to retrace his steps. And so that was just a general tactical mistake.
Before we move on further, for those of you watching on cable in Oklahoma, or those watching the streaming version of this, you can tweet me a question, and my Twitter handle is @MikeBetcher. That's @MikeBoettcher. As well, class, I'm going to open it up early like we did in previous classes, because this is your class. I want to get in as many questions as we can in the next hour and 15 minutes. So I'm going to ask a few more questions, but be ready with yours, because this again is your class, and our guests here in the audience, you're welcome to ask questions as well. So your abductors were Somali pirates, and they did not abduct you for political reasons.
No, that's right.
They wanted to hold you for ransom and wanted money. Is that correct?
And that was a difference between my case and Jim's. I was captured on land, but they were absolutely pirates, and we know that because they put me on a ship. I was actually held on the ocean for about 5 months. But all they wanted was money. You know, the first demand was $20 million, which of course they weren't going to get. But there was no question of them, you know, putting me up for political reasons. Or trying to get some political prize out of the U.S. government or the German government. And that's the difference between my case and Jim's case. And in that case, I think, in the case of a criminal kidnapping, information flows a little better. The cooperation with the FBI is a little better. My mom had actually a very good experience with the FBI agents who came to her door. And they were there, by the way, within 12 hours of my abduction.
So Diane, Jim is abducted in November 2012, several months after he was abducted in January. His was looked at as a criminal matter. How was Jim's case viewed by the U.S. government?
Well, Jim's was very different, because he was abducted by what our government considered a terrorist group. And again, the FBI was assigned, but there was a much more of a delayed response. We did not see the FBI until about 2 weeks after, and then it was about 2 weeks after that they actually went to the border of Syria. So the whole thing was very different, and we received really no information. Very little information from the government. They would interview me. They wanted to know what we knew more than the other way around. Yeah. Very different.
So you were told U.S. law prohibits the government from involving
at that point, well, we knew that our U.S. hostage policy doesn't allow for concessions or ransom or any of that, but what happened was our FBI was not even allowed to contact the captors or do any negotiation. So, of course, that made it very difficult.
Well, you know,
I mean, it was impossible, really. So we tried to do it as a family with some of their, you know, support, guidance. Like they'd say, send us an email and we'll look at it, kind of thing. But they were not, our hands were tied in Jim's case, you know, they weren't. Whereas I think the FBI's expertise was able to be used in your case, Mike.
I gave my mom a lot of advice.
Yeah, so it's just very different, you know, just a different designation of captor, if you will, you know.
What was that well, I don't want to ask what. It was hell for you those 2 years and the family.
And that's why the Foley Foundation has worked very hard with other hostage families like Michael's mom to, you know, we were all rather upset after that. And so the Obama administration did put out a new presidential policy directive. And now we have a fusion cell, interagency fusion cell, whose only job is to bring Americans home, and a presidential envoy. So there were some changes made in 2015. So at the Foley Foundation, that's one of the things we try to do, is to make sure that these changes are enduring and that our government is accountable to our citizens in this situation.
And that information flows a little better to the families. Right?
Exactly, that's the hope. But the other part is about protecting independent conflict journalists, just like you were saying, Mike. That's a very important part of our mission.
Well, I want to get into what the foundation is doing, and I did not mention in my introduction that Diane created the James Foley Legacy Foundation.
A lot of Jim's colleagues.
And a lot of Jim's colleagues, I mean, along with a lot of Jim's colleagues. We can put up the address for the website, and that'll be up behind us. So if you want to go in, it's jamesfoleyfoundation.org, correct? The thing, you know, I was kidnapped back in 1985 in El Salvador, and during that period, one thing I felt good about was that I worked for NBC News, and General Electric owned NBC, and the whole, if this thing went on for a long time, which thank God it didn't, the whole corporation was going to be mobilized. But you found out James had been abducted. He was a freelancer, and he's got his family, which is great. But what do you do? There's no roadmap.
We were very fortunate in that he, at least Global Post and AFP gave us quite a bit of support, in all fairness to them, which is unusual. I mean, a lot of freelancers wouldn't have received the support we did. So we did receive some support, but they weren't able to help us engage with the captors or that sort of thing, you know, so.
So the negotiations, all of those negotiations were handled by the family?
Right.
Via email?
Right. And the captors really didn't reach out to us till 1 year after, more than a year. How about with you? I don't know.
Well, the first phone call was in a week, but they stuck to the 20 million demand for about a year.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so it didn't make any difference from that point of view.
So, to release you, 20 million was the price tag.
Was the first price, yeah. And they didn't come down. I mean, they stuck to that, which is, and they knew as well as we did that it was a ridiculous demand. So.
And working with the FBI, was your family in your family was in the States or in
the States? Yeah. I also have family in Germany, but it was basically the U.S. took the lead.
But you were a dual U.S. German citizen.
U.S. German citizen, yeah. For sure.
And did that help your case? Because I mean, when you refer, in this era, basically the last thing you want to say if you're kidnapped in that part of the world is "I'm an American." So did you tell them first you were German?
I did, yeah. Oh, yeah. No, I traveled on my German passport. I told them I was a German. But they don't care. That doesn't matter. They knew I was a Westerner. They knew I was an outsider, and that's all that really mattered. They figured a Westerner has money. And that, they figured out later that I was maybe they did research beforehand, but they only figured out. It didn't matter what I said, They just figured out who to call. Who they wanted to call. They wanted to get both governments on the phone, but the governments wouldn't talk to them.
And 32 months later, you were released. I can't even imagine that length of time, but you were released, and it was for $1.6 million. Yeah. How'd you raise $1.6 million? I can barely raise $1.06.
My mom did with the help of some some of the magazines in the Pulitzer Center that were standing behind me, the places that I'd worked for, and some other institutions. So it was a question of raising a fund, and no, it wasn't easy. It certainly didn't come together all at once.
Diane, a video was made about, well, a movie called Jim, which aired on HBO in early 2016 and is still available out there, correct? It's fantastic if you haven't seen it. It's called Jim, and then I believe it premiered January 2016, I think. Yes. But there's a shorter film we're about to look at. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. The film is rather long. It's almost 2 hours. It's also available on Amazon too, but we needed something smaller, shorter, that just kind of captured some of who Jim was. So actually we used it at our Freedom Awards event last May. We have an event in Washington. So this was, Jim aspired to be a man of moral courage. So this is a little clip that's called Inspiring Moral Courage.
Okay, let's take a look at it.
I believe that frontline journalism is important. Without these photos and videos and first-hand experience, we can't really tell the world how bad it might be.
There does seem to be a strong sense that they won't give up the fight, and that there are a force of young fighting men. Although unorganized, there's plenty of will to hold out here.
If Gaddafi comes to Benghazi, are you guys prepared to fight?
No, but we have a strong faith. We won't give up.
Jim chose the stories that weren't being really shown in the mainstream media. He went a lot deeper than just showing bang bang, what we call like frontline images of people firing off guns.
Jim would just like listen. This taught me a lot as well about going into situations without preconceived ideas about it. He would go into a situation like obviously with a general idea, and then it would be malleable based on what would happen.
But today a lot of children, everyday children,
which allowed things to go into certain directions that it usually wouldn't, and you end up finding more.
Who are the Libyan rebels determined to overthrow 42 years of dictatorship?
I work in accountant. I have a small company.
I am welder. Working in offshore.
Offshore welder.
Platform, yeah.
Okay. Dangerous job.
He chose one story in particular about a Libyan fighter, actually, who went to Syria. And Jim spent quite a lot of time with him. His name was Firas. And he got very deep and very intimate into the story. And I think that's what I respect most about Jim, was that he wanted to show a different side of this stereotype. He took a different strand from that.
I would come back to Benghazi, and there was stuff going on there. There was families, and they were out there in the protests, and they were out there maybe handling medical supplies, which is probably more important to what this revolutionary movement was.
Like he said, he had that presence, but he never really projected himself onto a situation. And that's the best way to do things, I think. That's how you can be most effective in life, is presence, and to be there constantly for people. And that's like what I learned from him.
Jim had some extra clothes, and most of the guys who has extra clothes were just wearing them all the time because it was cold. And he told me, I have this pant, I don't use it, do you want it? And I was like, yeah, of course. And he didn't know me at all. He had another kind of intelligence, a kind of intelligence you cannot get like this, you know, social intelligence.
I said to James that, James, first time I met you was, you know, in this prison, and you looked as confused as if you were just dumped down on the earth from the moon or something. And you basically destroyed my whole idea of this great war journalist, James Wright Foley. And then suddenly I find out that you are very clumsy, you're very bad at sports. But then again, you're the most, I think I said to him, you know, You're the most honest person. There is no evil at all to find in you, James. You are pure good, sometimes too good. And I'm really happy that I've met you.
He was really trying to teach me, John, you need to look outside yourself. John, it's not about physical or monetary things. It's about how you act. And it's who you teach, who you mentor. Who's going to remember you? What are they going to remember about you?
You know, the thing is there's physical courage, right? For some reason, I have physical courage. But really, think about it, that's nothing compared to moral courage. I can go and get those shots, but if I don't have the moral courage to challenge authority, to write about things that are gonna maybe have reprisals on my career, if I don't have that moral courage, we don't have journalism.
Because people say oftentimes you must be a real adrenaline junkie. That's why you cover stories in conflict zones all the time. It's not about that. It's not about adrenaline. I mean, the whole thing about it's basically knowing that there's an injustice out there, or there's something bad happening out there, and someone's got to tell the story. You know, it's not. You know, certainly, yeah, adrenaline flows when you're in trouble, but that's not why you go there. That's not why you went there, and that's not why Jim went.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm not a thrill seeker, but I was onto an interesting story. You know, I got an idea in my head for a book, and there was obviously more to the Somali pirate story than was being told, and I thought I could write a very interesting book. Somalis become pirates obviously because they're poor. There was also a story that there were just disgruntled fishermen that turned to piracy. That turned out not to be true, but that sort of those levels of myth are interesting to me too. It was interesting to me in my second book, and I thought, well, there is real injustice here. There's also cruelty, you know, on the part of the pirates. There's a lot of mythology and a lot of layers that need to be teased out, and I was interested in all of that. And I thought I was going as a friend to the Somalis. So.
We have a question tweeted from Olin Field, and it reads, as someone who wants to become a combat correspondent, what would be the advice to someone in areas like Syria and northern Iraq? Which is a good question to segue into what your foundation, what the James Foley Legacy Foundation is doing in that regard.
Well, thank you, Mike. I think one of the things I've become rather passionate about since all this happened to Jim is that young journalists aspiring to do work in dangerous parts of the world are truly able to keep themselves safe. And I think, so one of the things we've done is put together a safety curriculum that actually 150 schools of journalism have requested, you know, and Oklahoma is very interested in implementing parts of that. And I think that is huge because we need courageous, talented journalists out in the world. There's no question about that. But Jim would have wanted, I certainly want as a mom, any of you to be very protected as you can be. And two of the basic areas that have come out have been this area of importance of digital security and the ability to be very good at risk assessment, assessing risk, looking at various scenarios, like you were just mentioning, Michael, coming to know how, because Westerners are watched, Westerners are targeted. And so I think it's very important that young journalists, first of all, hone their skills in less, you know, safer parts of the world, for sure. And also really know the areas that they're going into. and, you know, not be naive. Prepare families. That's the other thing, is to make sure that your family has an emergency folder with passwords and your information. I think that's critical too. But so we've become very passionate about that. So the Foley Foundation also helped bring together an international coalition called Culture of Safety Alliance, which is just really started in late 2015. And we're trying to address these issues because there's an increasing number of independent journalists doing the dangerous work. A lot of media companies don't want to send their staffers in some cases. And if they do, well then, as Mike said, they do all they can to protect them. But the problem is a lot of the independent journalists are doing that dangerous work. So they need help with insurance. They need help with security backup. They need access to safety training and equipment. So a lot of work to do there.
Michael, someone came to you and said, I want to go to Somalia. I know you were there for a long time, 32 months.
Well, first of all, I'd say don't. But someone did come to me. BuzzFeed sent Gina Moore to Somalia, I think in 2015, and her editor got in touch with me for security ideas. She went to the same place. She went to Galkayo, but only for a few days, and it was about a women's issue, female genital mutilation. And so that's, you know, that's also, that's not something that the locals necessarily want reported on, although there were probably activists that she talked to. You know, first I said don't, and then I gave some advice about hiring security. You know, she was insistent, but she also knew the area. I mean, she was based in Nairobi at the time, and I would say to anyone aspiring to go to just a conflict zone, you know, don't do it just for that. Don't do it just for the sake of of a dangerous assignment, but get to know a region first. I did that anyway, by the way. I mean, I did get to know East Africa before I went to Somalia. But don't go in cold. That's nonsense.
Rebecca Walters has a question. What can journalists in dangerous areas do to comfort, prepare their families? How do I justify this work to them? Good question.
Yeah, that's a good question. Talking to my mom beforehand, she's an adventurous lady too, so I mean, she obviously showed worry, but she didn't say don't go. So you know, you should be open with your family. But we were talking about how much you can sort of leave behind for your family, like an emergency folder. There's a whole lot of information that is worth just giving to your mother, basically. And insurance information, how to get into your bank accounts and internet accounts in case you die, a will, something like that. There's a whole lot of paperwork that I certainly didn't do before I left, you know, and I don't think Jim did.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And to the second part of her question, Diane, what do you think a journalist should tell their family? What did Jim tell you, preparing you?
I don't think he did a great job preparing us, to be honest. He didn't want me to worry. He knew I would worry. So he made light of it, to be honest. And that, I would totally agree with Michael, is not a fair approach, really, because if it's something you really intend to do, people love you. And so it's only fair to them to at least put some of this vital stuff together in the remote chance that you don't return or you get kidnapped or whatever, just like a soldier would do, really. I think it needs to be part of one's protocol if you choose to do dangerous work. But certainly from what she said, we need these courageous journalists, though, on the other hand. I remember Jim's passion. I mean, we need to, if we care about justice and freedom in the world, I mean, I don't think it's right for us to turn a blind eye to the things going on around the world. So, you know, I admire the work that Michael's done, Jim's done, and so many other courageous journalists, yourself included, Mike. I mean, I think this is vital work, and I think this kind of information is vital to our democracy, to our freedom, and to any hope for any understanding in the world. So I think it's very honorable work, but but you got to be safe doing it, and you got to be intentional about how you go about that. You know?
And as a freelancer, one of the things you have to figure out is where can you sell your work? You got to make a living, and that's one of the most difficult things. I mean, do you go there and produce it and then sell it, or do you pre-sell or tell people you're going there and set up contacts in the beginning? John Schmelzer, my great co-professor in this dream course, it's actually his idea, so it's his dream course, and I'm along for the ride on this. But John wanted me to point out that a lot of people may not understand what Global Post is. Do you mind saying what that is?
Global Post it no longer exists as it's an online news organization. It was primarily internationally focused because at that point in Boston, in New England, the Globe had a lot of print journalism. Newspapers have had to let go of their foreign bureaus just because of economics. And so this was an attempt to really gather a lot of stories internationally. So it's, you know, similar to AP and AFP, some of these online news organizations. And they really used a lot of freelancers. That's how they got their work.
Well, that's the business model now. I mean, that's
Yes.
what's changed.
Yes.
When you were saying you
So
went with a network and you felt you had support, you know, all that stuff is expensive. And because they've taken their correspondence out of the field, a lot of large American newspapers, freelancers have sort of filled the gap. That's not exactly what I was doing, but it's certainly what the Global Post was up to.
Definitely. And at times it's become rather abusive in that, you know, a lot of times these brave journalists would be risking their lives to get a photo or video or story and, you know, then not be able to afford a trusted fixer or car or place or hotel, that kind of thing. So that is partly why this Alliance for a Culture of Safety came together. And partly why we're you know, trying to get more schools of journalism to really be intentional about teaching students about these risks.
You know, companies I work for would always say, now we're sending you to cover this story, but you know, we don't want to see you get killed or hurt. You know, don't shoot bang bang just for the sake of shooting bang bang, which bang bang is a terminology used by journalists who are in conflict zones. It's been the terminology for decades that means fighting, you know, gunfire, bombs going off, that sort of thing. But then you say, okay, good, we're not going to press our crew out there. And the next day you find out that, wait, CBS, you get an email from your bosses saying CBS had this material, you didn't. You're getting mixed messages, and it's absolutely true. You get, and I can say what I know. I got mixed messages over the decades. We want you to be safe. At the same time, we want you to have the best material. And you can't reconcile those two. You're going to have to take risks.
It's a tension. And while I was still in, I think there was a good article in the New Yorker about, mostly focused on the hostages who'd been taken in Syria, saying, you know, when you do this kind of thing, sometimes that just happens, you know, things just go wrong. And so even with the proper precautions, someone can take against you and try and kidnap you.
Do we have questions up front here from Brian? Oh, let's go out back since you're back there already, and then we'll come up to Brian here. Hold on a second. Let's get the mic up to you. Okay.
My question goes to Mr. Moore. So, like, until 2015, the U.S. policy was no negotiations with terrorists of any kind. But when we're talking about human life, this policy can be a kind of a bit hurtful. But in a way, it will also stop people being taken by these terrorist groups for ransom. So what do you think about the change of this policy, and what do you think countries that still have this policy should do? Should they start negotiating with terrorists, or you think that's not a good idea?
Okay, that's a good question. I have two answers. One is that it's not that the U.S. changed its policy in 2015. There was some confusion at the White House level about whether the U.S. government should allow private money to flow to a terrorist group, and apparently that's never been against U.S. policy to allow that. But someone called up Diane with a different opinion. Obama's change in 2015 clarified that. What the U.S. doesn't do is speak to terrorists. They won't get on the phone and negotiate and that kind of thing, and they shouldn't. What is not true about what you just said, it's true that a kidnapping will fund future crimes. What's not true is that this strict policy of non-payment is a deterrent to future crimes. So anyone from the State Department can get up at a podium and say, we pay no ransoms. And everyone in the United States might know that policy. My pirates didn't. While I was sitting there in Somalia, one of my guards came up and said, Michael, I'd been there for 1.5 years. Michael, I just heard America pays no ransom. Yeah. You know, why? Haven't you heard? You know, these guys kidnap first and then ask questions. As far as what the countries that do negotiate and might pay behind the scenes, that's an awfully good question. In Jim's case, there was an international group of hostages in Syria, and the ones who came out alive had a European background. So it is a matter of lives at stake. I'm actually not against a rescue policy, but a rescue policy has to be absolutely consistent with American hostages, and unfortunately that means more hostages would die. But that's also the only way to communicate that message, that the U.S. or whatever the country might be pays no ransoms, and it can mean a kidnapper's life if they do it. There are only a few countries in the world that can do that. A few countries have special forces that can do that. So that leaves the rest of the world with very few options.
If I may comment on that too, I feel there's a need to actually research our U.S. hostage policy, because the way it is now, just like Michael says, I mean, there are good reasons not to pay ransom, if you will. But when you look at a lot of the outcomes for Americans compared to other Western nations have been pretty poor. A lot of Americans have died. So I think it's important to make sure that our policy does protect us when we're in this situation, that we are as consistent as possible so other countries know what the situation is, because it's a very complex issue. It really is. And different countries look at it differently. And I think it's just important that as a country we have it adequately researched. Because all that changed really in 2015, as Michael said, was that now we have an interagency government group whose job it is to help find ways to get Americans out. But it didn't change our policy at all, really.
You know, I'm uncomfortable with U.S. policy in that I get it. We negotiate with criminals, or the FBI would become involved, but terrorists are criminals too. Mm-hmm. And that seems like an incredibly hair-thin line. I can see the political side of it, but if you pay a criminal, he's going to do more crimes because it makes him money. Just as the government says, if we pay terrorists, they're going to do more terrorism. I mean,
yeah, I tend to think that, I mean, I think it's I know it's very complex, but if you don't engage the captors or negotiate in any way, there's no way you're going to get anyone out, you know? So, you know, it depends on how a country feels about it. But I do think it's important to look at the research so that, you know, if we say our policy protects us, well, let's make sure it does. Yeah. That's all. And I think that's the bottom line, and there's not been enough recent research on that. I think the other thing in terms of journalists is that there's this whole feeling of impunity, meaning there's no accountability often when journalists are targeted, killed. You know, nobody, rarely, I was reading, the UN was saying there's 8% of attacks on journalists are actually brought to trial. I mean, no wonder people feel they can attack journalists. You know, it's just not a crime that's necessarily followed up. So actually November 2nd, UNESCO calls that the Day of Impunity. So it's a day when we need to, you know, speak out that people who commit these crimes actually are accountable for their actions.
What should be our message on November 2nd and that Day of Impunity?
Well, their message is #end impunity, meaning that we need to hold people accountable when they target journalists. I mean, it's been 3 years since Jim and Stephen Sotloff and our 2 other Americans, and then Luke Summers, I mean, Marie Colvin. We've had a lot of journalists in the last few years who've been killed. And I don't know any of them who've actually been brought to trial at this point. Do you know? So that is another issue, a big one that
I heard about Jim in Somalia. I don't know if you realize that, but I was still captive in the summer of 2014. But at that point, I had a radio. I think he was kidnapped during a news blackout where I had no radio, no news or anything. So I didn't know he was kidnapped. But I heard about the video on the BBC that very morning, and my guards heard about it too, and they came up to me and said, "Michael, you know, James Foley," and I said, "Yeah, it was pretty grim." He said, "It's not going to happen to you." I'm like, "I don't know that. You've been threatening to sell me to Al-Shabaab for 2 years."
You weren't exactly treated kindly there.
No.
You were beaten many times.
I was beaten, but not systematically, but I was beaten, you know, whenever they felt like it. But the threat for a long time actually was also to sell me off to pretty serious terrorists who actually at that point would have been interested in having an American to behead to attract the attention of the IS. The allegiances were changing within Al-Shabaab in Somalia, so there was a risk.
That was always the concern in Iraq, is that one group would get you, and they knew you had value if you're an American, and they would sell you to Al-Qaeda in Iraq or to some other group. That's what the pirates kept
threatening to do in my case, yeah. They threatened it mainly on the phone to my mother, but you know, I heard those threats too.
You think, why didn't they? I mean, it would have been easy for them to do that, probably.
Yeah, well, actually, they don't like each other. So ideologically, they're different. They're both very Muslim, but pirates tend to be Sufi, as opposed to fundamentalist. So they'll go to war over that. They shoot each other over that, and they shoot at each other over influence in certain parts of Somalia. So most of the time, they would rather not pay the other side. But if there's a good political reason, which there started to be in 2014, then Al-Shabaab starts to be interested in this kind of thing. So I didn't take their threats very seriously. I didn't know that the calculus had actually changed because of IS around that time. So it's also complicated.
Brian, you have a question?
Hi. Can you hear me? Michael, can you please explain how did humor allow you to keep your sense of self and humanity? How were you able to find humor in such terrible circumstances, and what exactly did you find humor in?
Well, it's not that I found all that much humor in what I was going through. It's that every now and then I noticed that there was still I would hear things on the radio that were funny, and I would be able to laugh. You know, and I noticed that there was a level of a kind of inner joy that was not related to my circumstances, that was accessible, and that's still a really interesting topic to me. And so when I say that humor helped me through, it's not that, you know, I tried to crack jokes to keep my mood up. It's that being able to detach myself from those circumstances and attain that level of joy now and then, it really didn't happen very often, was absolutely crucial.
I was rereading your story in The Guardian today. I'd read it when it had come out with interest. And both times the thing that stuck with me was your first thought, because it was my first thought when I was in trouble, which was my family.
What about my family? Yeah.
What are they going to think?
Yeah. No, I knew it was going to be a burden on them right away. And I wanted to, I wanted to backtrack. You can't, though.
You can't go back. No. Go back in time.
No, and my mother. I mean, within 12 hours, like I said, the FBI was at my mom's door, and she says she hasn't said it to me, but I know she said it, and so I'm quoting her. Oh, it was the worst day of her life. That's not fair.
Well, that gets to a point, because, I'll just speak for myself, and you can all speak from your perspective, but I always felt that what I was doing was for a greater good, a cause, a story that needed to be told. There were people being abused. Apartheid was, for example, in South Africa. We had to go into the townships and tell those stories, despite what was going on in the violence. And then I felt like I talked to my family, and I'd tell them, I have to do this story, but the older I get, the more I know what we do is inherently selfish. We feel like it's unselfish because we're putting our lives on the line. But at the same time, to our wives and husbands and children, we are, every day we step out the door to go and say goodbye and tell this story, just like a cop on the beat. We might not come back, and we leave chaos in our wake if something happens.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an essential role. I mean, I think no one else is going to tell these stories if we don't. On the other hand, there's some romantic idealism that goes along with that, and of course, that can be selfish.
But Diane, as a mother, I mean, you getting what I'm saying? I mean, because we're being very selfish to our families.
Well, I think, but that goes back to what I said previously. I just think part of the responsibility then of a journalist doing that is to have those frank conversations with people who love you, and to have emergency folders, and to prepare as much as possible should the worst occur. That would have been really helpful in our case. I was very proud of the work Jim was doing. I really was. And he could have been doing so many other things, but this was his passion. And I, as a mom, have to, admire that. Sure, it's been really hard on his family. And I think that's very true, but that's true of a police officer, a fireman, or soldier, anyone who does work that is inherently dangerous, but needed in the world, Mike. So I guess I don't see it as that selfish, to be honest. I think their vital roles we wouldn't be free without the best of journalism. We wouldn't without the truth that comes from your work. So,
well, let me put someone on the spot here. Storm, I'm going to put you on the spot because you want to be, it's one of the things you're considering to be, is an international foreign correspondent. And since you've taken this class, you and your family have had some discussions about this because of some of the materials you've studied for this class. Tell us about that whole dynamic in your family going on right now.
No, sure. This class has been extraordinary, and we're so lucky to have it here at the university. But I have been showing my family all the wrong films. In the meantime, Mike's The Hornet's Nest. We watched that together. Jim, the James Foley story. I think as a young journalist, it's good. I don't know. It's been really interesting. My parents definitely, I think it's special to be able to take in those experiences and the experiences of these journalists that have gone before, but they are definitely not okay with that right now. But I think it is good to be able to share that with them and to be able to talk about it. And they know it's in my mind, and I think that's good to have at least that understanding of what the future may hold. I had a question for Diane. You talked about anyway, the data into impunity, and I was just wondering what justice has came to the people who killed James, and 5 years, almost 5 years after he was taken. What is justice to your family, and what do you want to see happen to the people that took him?
Well, ideally, I think it would. I, as a mom, would like them to be identified, brought to trial, held accountable. Storm, you know, and if they were the ones inflicting the terrorism, really, they were really very brutal, and not just to the Western hostages at all. I mean, they were even as bad, if not worse, to the civilians in the area. So, I mean, they just effectively terrorized the country. I just feel those people should be held accountable, brought to trials, similar to what they did after World War II. I mean, these have been crimes against humanity. So I'm afraid I don't feel much solace in them just being bombed, if you will. That's easy way out for them. I mean, it sounds awful. But I also think the bombing and that just fuels more violence and more hatred towards the West. This is just my personal feeling, but justice to me would be an accountability for their crimes, and yeah.
But one of those that intelligence experts are pretty sure was involved was Jihadi John, and he was killed. Mm-hmm. Jihadi John was a nickname given to a British member of ISIS who you're convinced, and I mean, it was confirmed. He was there in the videos that was responsible, one of those responsible for his death. And he was killed in a drone strike.
Right. What about the people that took you, Michael? So there are several pirate bosses at large and free in Somalia who probably should be in an American jail. But a couple of days after I flew out of Somalia, about 5 bosses had an argument over my ransom, and they killed each other in a gunfight. So that eased the FBI's job a little bit. But there are still a couple of top financiers who should, from my point of view, really should be in jail in New York.
John, you have a question? John Schmelzer?
Yeah, you mentioned at dinner something about how Michael was captured. I mean, how James was captured. And you were speaking about digital security. Talk a little bit about that and what went down and what you think happened.
Well, and this is what I think happened, and this was in 2012, so we weren't as savvy. I don't think digital security had progressed as much as it has in the last 5 years, but the bad actors were quite savvy. And I really feel that they were tracking Jim and his British colleague, and within a few miles of the Turkish border, Jim and his colleagues stopped to download material to send to media companies, and I think right there that was a huge mistake, because they were identified as Westerners there, easily tracked. They were immediately captured right after that. And so I think lessons like that, and like what Michael was saying about retracing roads, I mean, I think it's important to look at case studies like this. And this is what we try to do in the safety curriculum, to learn from these various scenarios, to talk to journalists who've been in those areas. And a lot of that has to do with assessing the risk. Is it worth, stopping to download material when in a few more miles you'll be safely across the border? Just really being real intentional about one's own safety. And again, how we can be tracked with our cell phones. I mean, people can track us, can identify who we are by going into our Facebook accounts if they're not protected. Using encrypted email, using encrypted places to store material, to protect our sources, your sources on your computers. So all of these things, I really think these days, journalists need to really be good at digital security and really good at balancing the risk, the value of a story, or getting it to one's editor versus one's own safety. Do you have some?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I was researched before I was kidnapped. So, and I had a feeling that would be a problem. In other words, before I went to Somalia, I scrubbed my internet presence a little bit. But you can't take everything off. And in fact, after I was captured, one guard showed me my own picture on his phone. And it was a picture from an interview I'd done with the New York Times for my second book. So they had obviously looked at all that and read it and even downloaded a photo of me, which I imagine they spread around to all the guards before I was kidnapped, just so they could identify me. That's simply how it is in an age of the internet. I couldn't have scrubbed everything. I couldn't have taken down all my pictures or anything. But it's a consideration. You have to think about that before you go.
You have to, and sometimes you have to work out, in terms of digital security, you have to know what sorts of names and things to stay away from when you're communicating with the people who've hired you back home. For example, to do a story. For example, in 2000, I went to Beirut to work on this documentary called One Day Soon, about the likelihood of a mass casualty terrorism event in the U.S. within 1 year for CNN. And that 1 year happened. But one person we were trying to contact at that point was the most wanted terrorist in the world, more than bin Laden. His name was Imad Mughniya. He'd killed more Americans than any other terrorist. For example, he's the one that planned and carried out the Marine barracks bombing in 1982. Several hijackings, the bombings of the Israeli embassy and Jewish community center in Buenos Aires, and many, many other attacks. And he had many different disguises, had several plastic surgeries, no one could find him, and I had a way to contact him. But in emails, we never mentioned his name. We had a code worked out. We called him Fred. So when I was communicating back with my bosses in Atlanta, we talked about, Fred. We sent a letter to Fred, we got a response, and we never used that name. And so there are little things like that too that you can possibly do. Just, it's one of those tricks. Bridget Waltemar asks on Twitter, have journalism organizations taken any steps to develop military SEER-like training for reporters? Would it be beneficial to do so? So is that, what we're talking about, SEER?
Yes, I would think that's like the HEFAT training, right? Yeah, the hostile environment first aid training. I mean, most staff journalists have that. That's just like everyone has that. I'm sure you had it, Mike, and Jim had several courses in that regard. I think there are two problems, several, but one of them is that it's a lot of times independent journalists don't have access to that training because it's quite expensive. It's $3,000 to $5,000 depending on how long the training is. So it's something a freelancer really can't access. But the other issue is a lot of times that training is very military oriented, which can be really helpful in conflict zones. But a lot of the danger is not in the middle of a war, like the way Michael was captured. And a lot of times it could be, if you had strong skills, at least I like to think, basic core competencies in risk assessment, in digital security, that right there, that would be very protective. And I just, we need both. The Culture of Safety Alliance is trying to improve access to the hostile environment training for freelancers. As a matter of fact, the Foley Foundation trained or gave scholarships to 12 freelancers in September to do that with a security company. So more and more media companies are stepping up. Reuters and the AP have helped train some freelancers. So together we are providing more of that. But I also feel there needs to be even a more of a core competency. How do you feel about that, though, Michael?
Well, there's actually an interesting solution in Germany. There are a couple of pretty strong unions that journalists belong to in Germany, and at least one of them offers those courses not very often, only a couple of times a year. But if you belong to the union, then I don't think the fee is very high. I think it's in the hundreds, not the thousands. So it's actually not bad.
Well, let's do an exercise here right now, and this means all of you are going to have to participate because Diane, you're going to journalism schools, other journalism schools as well, and trying to, and in some cases have developed courses on journalism safety, journalist safety abroad, but it's not just abroad anymore, it's journalist safety at home, and that's part of what this course is about. You know, not only from terrorists and dictators, but we're under threat from politicians as well. How do we, let's design a journalism safety course. What can we do, and I want suggestions from you, what you would want to know, and we'll get it designed. And let's do it let's get the business done now and get it done. So what kind of advice have you given to other journalism schools on this, on what we should know? And I'd like your input, and I'd like what you all would like to see in this course.
Well, I'd love to hear what the students say. We have 4 seminars that are up on our website that schools of journalism can access. The first seminar really revolves around the James Foley film, Jim, the James Foley story. How many of you saw that? That was shown, so some of you did. So that film in the first seminar is used to raise awareness and for students to problem solve what they would have done differently, how, you know, what they think about the issues, that sort of thing. And then we have one seminar on civil unrest, as Mike's saying. I mean, right in our own country, we've had a lot of various protests and things that are very dangerous for journalists. But so our most recent one is on digital security.
Digital security,
but
okay.
We do a lot of work with looking at various scenarios to assess risk, to just develop the ability to do that, so that it isn't an offhand thing, but something that's very intentional.
So what do you think? We'd look first at digital security. What do you suggest we should be looking at? Would you want to have a scenario? And, you know, you're assigned, we'll draw up a certain scenario where you're assigned to cover a certain story that's ongoing right now somewhere. Any suggestions? Maybe we won't do this course if there are no suggestions. I mean, I would really, on the digital security thing, that is so key because these people do their homework on you.
They do, yeah.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, they do.
And, yeah.
The other thing I should have mentioned about the German course is that the union does it in cooperation with the German military. So I think the preparation is not bad, but nothing can prepare you for that. And one thing I think is missing from most of these classes is that I could have benefited from, just from my own experience, is how to do a hunger strike. There are skills that need to be learned. psychological skills too.
So, okay, now let's talk, because the psychological aspect of this is something we should really focus on. So we should look at psychological skills. You said how to do a hunger strike. You wrote in your Guardian article something that I found very fascinating, and it's the fight against victimization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was important.
Can you tell me about that more?
Well, I mean, you are being victimized, but if you play that role, you're sunk. So you have to not let them, not treat yourself as a victim. In other words, not fall into that trap of actually feeling like a victim 24 hours a day. You are, but you have to stop that.
What are some ways that you went about doing that?
It was mental. Again, it was a kind of detachment from what was going on. Yoga helped a little bit. So did writing. When I had a pen and a notepad or a notebook, I could sort of go off somewhere else, and then I wasn't being victimized, at least not in my head, you know.
What are some of the ways that it's like affected you now that you're away from it?
Oh, well, now. Now nothing victimizes me. No, my mom says that too. She's like, she doesn't get impatient in traffic anymore because I'm back. No, that helps. And the idea that I mentioned in the Guardian piece, which comes from Epictetus, is, you know, the temptation is to say, why me? Why did this happen to me? And the answer from Stoic philosophy is, well, why not you? You know, this could happen to anybody. Or misfortune happens to everybody, in fact. So you have to take yourself out of that that cycle of suffering. Otherwise, I would not have survived if I hadn't. Yeah. I just wouldn't have.
I don't have any like concrete ideas.
We need a microphone because. Yeah.
Sorry. Okay, I don't have any like concrete ideas of how we can put a course together, but I think it's definitely we should start earlier because I'm a junior and this is the first year I've heard of this kind of stuff. So I think it would be really good if we could maybe implement a course where we put it maybe even in the 1013 course and teach them about the real world stuff. I know it's early, but we need to start this early because this is a conversation I'm having as a junior. I think maybe it could even be a course of like physical safety as well as the psychological safety, because that's definitely something, I mean, that we don't really talk about. We just talk about how to write a story, how to go out and talk to people. There's not this other aspect of real world issues. So I don't have any answers, but I just wanted to pose that question.
Good.
Okay.
No, I like that. Megan, you have a question? Can you hand that mic over to Megan? Or an observation on a course? Either way.
A little bit of both, I guess. I'm kind of in the same boat that Storm's been in a little bit, in the sense that this is work that I've been considering a lot and really believe in and feel called to, but then that's also resulted in some kind of tough conversations with my parents this semester, and it's really forced me to consider what that would mean for me, or like what that would put them through, or could put them through. And so, you know, I was probably one of the few people in the world who have a perspective even similar to what you have. I mean, have you ever seen kind of the impact of Jim's life and death? Have you been able to come to terms with the risks that he took? And if you could go back and to those conversations before he left, would you have been more insistent, or at this point, you know, have you been able to, I don't know, just come to terms with it, I guess, or is that just something as a mother that you don't get to?
Well, I think that's a great question. Everyone's different in how you grieve. For me, continuing Jim's work has been a way of healing. There's just no question about it. There's no way I could have deterred Jim. Someday when you become a mother, you'll see. I mean, your children, all of us need to do what you feel called to do in some ways. And certainly it's important to protect the people we love. And so we do. I think we do have a responsibility for that, for sure. But on the other hand, you know, I never could have prohibited Jim from doing what he did. That's what he was called to do. He has inspired so many people and brought attention to these important issues. One of the reasons we're talking about them now is because of Jim and Stephen and a lot of these brave journalists who have lost their lives to keep us free, if you will. So we need them, but he would want all of you to be safe. So that's the challenge. That's the challenge, is to do this important work, but to do it in ways that you're very intentional about your own safety and the value of stories versus your own risk to yourselves. And, you know, so I think it's a very important conversation. But I, you know, wouldn't have been able to deter Jim. I mean, I think we all have to follow what we think we're called to in life, you know. And it is a very noble profession, and it's vital work. So it's that difficult piece. And that's why I'm hoping through Alliance for a Culture of Safety, more safety education, that we all can be empowered as journalists and as a journalist community, international community, to work to protect press freedom. Because that's what it's about. I mean, the more people are not allowed to have, you know the news, you know, then we're going to limit what we know about the world, aren't we? We're not going to know what's happening around the world.
Yeah, that's
Please,
essential.
Michael.
Press freedom has to be exercised. But even before you get to a conflict zone, I mean, there are other principles. You know, you can, I don't know what your parents think, but if you're interested in going abroad to report on stories that are outside the United States, I mean, do it. God, the world is full of fantastic stories. But the point is not you in this foreign place. The point is to like the film said about Jim, to take yourself out of it and try to understand as best you can what goes on in these places. And that's more important than whether it's extremely dangerous or not. And an extremely dangerous story should certainly not be sought out for its own sake, any more than, you know, reporting in a foreign country. All these things have to be subordinate to the story that you have to tell. You know?
And that is what risk assessment really is.
Right.
I mean, you've got to assess the value of the story, what risk it is for you, you know, that kind of thing. Yeah. Not easy to do, but certainly, I certainly agree with you, Michael. Very important to become a seasoned journalist first, know what you're doing, and, you know, then learn about the different countries and stories to make sure this is something worth reporting, right? Yeah, because there are some wonderful, important things going on.
In recent years, I've seen journalists like Rukmini Callimachi with the New York Times appear to take on a new approach since James Foley's death. And it appears that she's been able to infiltrate ISIS sympathizers through the internet and some of their communications and, for example, websites like GroupMe and the ways they communicate with each other and encoded drop boxes. Could this be a possible future frontier for journalists to expose, to be able to cover these hard-pressed conflicting issues from a safe position rather than being on the front line every single time to get some of those leading stories of development?
Well, sure. I mean, Rukmini's doing really good work decoding this mysterious group, but that's partly unique to that story. For a while, IS was kind of a locked box, and nobody quite understood where they came from. It was actually, if you were there, I guess it was clear where they came from. But that's a little bit different from understanding the shape of a war or the movement of a battle or something like that. So yeah, absolutely, she's exploiting technology to really good use. But I'm not sure that replaces going out in the field.
Cyber's another front line.
Yes,
for sure. And it can, in the end, if you're chasing that, it can be very dangerous as well.
Very true. Very true.
And I think that it's, yeah, I mean, she's onto something, you're onto something on this. I mean, it is, you have to have a very great understanding of the complexities of the way these groups communicate. And that's why I always say, you know, try to broaden your educational experience in the things that you're learning. You want to know the region you're going to. You want to, if you can, know the language, and you want to know the tools they're using, which are now digital tools. And so all of those things are important. And I think in any course we develop, those sorts of strategies and reporting should be looked at. I think that, you know, as we develop a course, I think, you know, the first thing we want to do is talk about the personal aspects. But first we want to answer the question, why do we do this? And that's what we all need to understand, why we do what we do. And then I think before you do anything else, it's communicating with your family, because that's the most important thing you have in your life, is your family. It took me a while to learn that. It's not your job, it's your family. Because it's your family that's going to be left battling for you if you cannot battle for yourself, and sitting next to me is living proof to that. And then I think you need to understand the various types of threat, both in civil unrest and, you know, threats on the battlefield. I mean, if you're covering a war zone, you have to be able to recognize the sound difference between you know, American munitions and an AK being used. They have distinctive sounds. You have to know which way to jump and run and hide and seek cover with the mortar. That's going to be different from the cover you're going to seek if it's an artillery shell coming in. I mean, these are complex things. And then you were talking about the aspect of, you know, when you're a hostage, you had a hunger strike, how to do a hunger strike. Back in the 70s, when I was a student here, and I studied under one of the godfathers of modern terrorism study, Dr. Stephen Sloan, and I used to travel around the country with Dr. Sloan, and we'd go from different police departments, and this was all worked out. We would take policemen hostage, and they felt what it would be like to be a hostage. And believe me, after about 4 hours of this, you start believing you're a hostage. At least it gives you that sort of a feel. And some of those things are done with some of the courses that the networks and major newspapers use. These hostile environment programs are very good, but they need to be extended and refined into journalism schools, and the foundation is taking those steps, as are others, and I think we need to all work together to create a really core curriculum that encompasses this and many other things that we don't have time to get to right now. We're about to go ahead. Oh, 1 minute. I thought you had a question for me. Okay. Both of you have been to hell and back, and now that you're back, are making the world a better place. Certainly, you've made our college, Gaylord College, a better place. You've made our university a better place by sharing what you know, and I can't wait to read your book.
It's out next year.
And what's it going to be titled?
The Desert and the Sea.
The Desert and the Sea. And the foundation, again, the website for the foundation.
The JamesFoleyFoundation.org.
I love that you're here. I love both of you, and I know our students are so enriched by this. I want to thank President David Bourne of the University of Oklahoma for funding this course, part of the President's Dream course, Journalism Under Siege. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we can continue on here for a little bit, and we're off. I think the stream is still going, but continue on with questions. We're off of Cox Cable now. Yes.